is our author for the evening, Peter Janney. He grew up in Washington, D.C., where his dad was a senior career CIA official. He has graduated from Princeton with a degree in American history. He earned a doctoral degree from BU in psychology, and he completed an MBA at Duke. That's all.
Yeah.
That's
enough.
He's a very gifted prose stylist.
He's a practicing psychologist on the North Shore, and this is his first book. Hopefully he'll tell us about the process and this interesting topic that, for all the things I know about the Kennedys, this is all new to me. And he has brought some copies of his books if you'd like to purchase one, and he'll be happy to sign it after the program. So please join me in welcoming Peter Janney.
I'd like to speak to you this evening for about 40 minutes. I don't want to speak any more than that because a lot of what I'm going to say I think is going to bring up certain issues that we all resonate with to one degree or another in this day and age. And I'd like to give each of you a chance to either make comments or ask questions, because what I have to say is pretty provocative, and I don't expect you to leave this evening believing me. What I want to do most of all is challenge each of you to find out for yourself what the truth is, what your truth is, what you believe. You have a great tool in your midst in this day and age, and that's the internet. And there's a lot of great information easily accessible, not only about the Kennedy assassination, as you know, but about any issue that you want to gain further knowledge of. And that's what makes, in my opinion, the internet so successful, and particularly at this particular time. And so let me just begin by saying that for the last 50 years, our government and the forces that control it have done nothing but attempt to confuse you and I as citizens with regard to what really took place on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas. What did take place that day was a conspiracy at the highest levels of our government, a bona fide coup d'etat, to not only assassinate our 35th president, but to end America's experiment in democracy. A second conspiracy began that very moment, the cover-up of what actually was taking place in Dallas. It was a conspiracy so vast and pervasive that it transformed our society and our culture, undermining the very pillars of the democratic process and eviscerating our republic. And with the assassination of President Kennedy, the Central Intelligence Agency, having been engendered just 16 years earlier, had exactly what it wanted, namely the ability to put a president in place who would follow the CIA's script, which was something President Kennedy had repeatedly demonstrated he would not do. How did we get there? As a trained clinical psychologist, I can't help but look at our overall decline, and particularly our impending ecological crisis, without a sense of terror. Mankind's karma awaits an accounting. And then I've had to ask myself, is there a connection with all that is happening today with what took place in Dallas in 1963? This, for me, has been one of the driving quintessential questions in my life. Like most of my generation, I arrived at college in the mid-1960s, excited by the vast possibilities of learning and knowledge. But America's untold and in some ways hidden history began to haunt me as I wrestled in the foreground of what was taking place in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. I became increasingly agitated and troubled. You see, having a father who just happened to make a career at the highest levels of the CIA further compounded my personal predicament. Into that mix were the added ingredients of his alcoholism and arrogance, and the kind of self-perpetuating narcissism that by definition never allowed for any real self-examination or accountability. As I wrote in the prologue of my book, Mary's Mosaic, I brought up the fact in 1966 that New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison was challenging the entire veracity of the Warren Report as a massive cover-up, implicating the CIA in President Kennedy's assassination. When I brought this to my father's attention for discussion, he became immediately apoplectic that I should even ever consider such a thing. It was yet another encounter that would lead to the inevitable, a never-to-be-resolved rupture in our relationship. Now, before you on the screen, is a document, and I came across this document in which my father chaired a senior high-level meeting at the CIA in 1967. This is where they expected to get a conviction. The CIA was very concerned that Garrison would in fact get a conviction of Clay Shaw for the role that he played in the conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy. Here's the subject. It's Garrison Group Meeting number 1. It takes place in 1967. All the top people in the CIA are at this meeting, including a man by the name of Raymond Roca on the Counterintelligence Division, who was James Jesus Angleton's chief protege. Angleton is notoriously represented in this day and age as possibly having been one of the actual architects of how the CIA would orchestrate JFK's assassination in Dallas. And you can see at this time, the CIA was very worried. We're just in 1967. Roca tells the meeting that Garrison is indeed going to obtain a conviction for Shaw for conspiring to assassinate President Kennedy. They're already getting worried that this is going to take place, and they need to start doing something to possibly fend off from this happening. As you can see, the meeting is signed by my father right at the bottom there. Now, the CIA was so worried at this point that what it did is that it sent out a memo to all the section chiefs in all the other stations, and it suggested that the term conspiracy theorist should be used for anyone who was criticizing the Warren Report findings. Remember, the Warren Report came out in 1964. 3 years later, Garrison is raising the red flag that something is very, very wrong here. So the term conspiracy theorist, which you hear today, was actually engendered by the CIA. They injected this particular term into our culture, and of course, it has stayed with us from ever since they did that. Before the term conspiracy theorist came, we used to refer to someone who differed with the Oswald as the lone nut assassin as an assassination theorist, not a conspiracy theorist, because clearly today, to be called a conspiracy theorist is a way to smear, denounce, and defame anyone who dares to speak about any crime committed by the state, military, or intelligence services. Now remember, before Edward Snowden, anyone claiming a kind of total surveillance of internet and phone traffic would have been named a conspiracy nut. Today, everyone knows better because they know this is in fact taking place. People who want to pretend that conspiracies don't exist when in fact they are among the most common modus operandi of significant historical change throughout the world and in our country become furious when this illusion is challenged. And this is why it's critical to understand that the primary means of immobilizing each and every one of us as citizens is to keep us in a state of confusion in which anything can be believed, but nothing can be known for sure. And by and large, the American people today are more than willing to be held captive in this state, only because to truly know the truth, as opposed to having a believable opinion, is to face the awful terror that we as citizens can no longer evade our responsibility as citizens. It is precisely in moving from belief to knowledge that the citizen moves from irresponsibility to responsibility, from hopeless helplessness to empowered action in the faith of one's rational capacity. My own personal journey in this regard was fraught with the challenges and obstacles, only because I refused to be tempted into the normal web of denial. Fortunately, I was able to take solace in the camaraderie of my generation engaged in an emerging counterculture during the late 1960s. But I was confronted very quickly with the reality that I could never really go home again. As the author Carlos Castaneda once echoed, which I mention in my book, we either make ourselves strong or we make ourselves miserable. The amount of work is the same. It took me years to realize that I had grown up living in the belly of the beast because my sheltered, privileged upbringing had insulated me from against knowing otherwise. Yet as an undergraduate in college, I had the wonderful good fortune of having history professor Martin Duberman, first as a teacher and then as my advisor. And it was here that I came to realize that historical truth is the ultimate navigational lighthouse which should guide humankind when we grope for an accurate diagnosis in any crisis. Without it, any real understanding is impossible, which ultimately means that we are destined to repeat the same mistakes over and over again, whether on a personal level or on a national level. A true healing, a true reckoning in our country can only take place in an atmosphere where truth and the pursuit of truth is allowed to reign supreme. And yet we must remember the limits of any historical account, for with history we are always dealing with fragments of evidence. What comes down to us from the past is very often a small fraction of what actually took place. And that fraction tends to represent the interests of the privileged classes, since they were the only ones through human history who knew how to write, who knew how to keep records. That immediately sets up a bias, simply in terms of the evidence. A historian's values, both conscious and unconscious, though not necessarily made explicit, in addition to the incomplete nature of the surviving fragmented historical evidence, always in the end stands in the way of a fully dispassionate and intact reproduction of the past. Which brings us to the unavoidable conclusion that all history is revisionist. The judgment of history is never set because history is ultimately just a moving dialogue. Historians are still fighting over the American Revolution. Every piece of written history is therefore ultimately subjective, for there's no such thing as true objectivity, given the laws of quantum mechanics and physics. While historical accuracy and objectivity must always remain the historian's holy grail, it can only be approximated and never really consummated. Still, there is much a good historian can achieve, particularly by exposing those facts that any society tends to hide about itself. Facts about wealth and poverty, tyranny and lies, and then, of course, assassinations and murder. There are libraries full of books about what the United States has done right, and the United States has done a lot of things right. But what about looking at what the United States has done wrong, so that we have a greater chance of getting it right in the future? In part, this was precisely what the former military intelligence officer and Cold War historian L. Fletcher Prouty was referring to when he warned us that one of the greatest casualties of the Cold War era had been the truth and the pursuit of truth. At no time in our history, in American history, has the general public been so misled, so betrayed, as it was in the last half of the 20th century by the work of the propaganda merchants and their so-called historians. For this is part of how America's fledgling experiment in democracy became eviscerated. Remember that it was Fletcher Prouty who Oliver Stone used to form the character of Mr. X in his 1991 film JFK, which I'll discuss more in a moment. So therein lies the cancerous tumor upon the soul of America. The CIA's inception and entrance into the American landscape fundamentally altered not only the functioning of our government, but our access to the real truth of what actually took place. Simply put, the CIA's reign has contaminated the pursuit of historical truth. While the dismantling of America's republic didn't begin in Dallas in 1963, that day surely marked an unprecedented acceleration of the erosion of our democratic republic, and I believe we've never recovered. The CIA's influence in our own country became pervasive in the 1950s, and the real damage came as they infiltrated the media so as to influence public opinion. Project Mockingbird was the agency's way of infiltrating the media. It wormed its way into more than 25 newspapers and wire agencies, successfully manipulating the American media to promote the CIA viewpoint. Through it, the CIA bought influence at major media outlets, putting reporters on the CIA payroll and vice versa. During the 1950s, an estimated 3,000 salaried and contract CIA employees were engaged in propaganda efforts. Under the CIA's Cord Meyer, who was the ex-husband of Mary Meyer, who I'll be talking about in just a minute, Mockingbird became a stunning success. Whenever the CIA wanted a news story slanted in a particular direction, it got it. This amounted to a subversion of democracy's most precious cornerstone, the free press. And this is largely why we don't have real independent investigative journalism anymore. If you are a journalist working for a major newspaper or major media outlet of any kind, you are subject to your editors' and producers' decision and their point of view. Writing about the Kennedy assassinations, either one of them, or the fact that nearly 2,000 licensed structural engineers and registered architects have now gone on record that the 9/11 World Trade buildings were brought down not by the planes that crashed into them, but by controlled demolition. These would be considered career-killing stories. You would be fired. Just ask the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Chris Hedges, who was fired from the New York Times because he would not support George Bush's war in Iraq. To expose the truth as a journalist or as a whistleblower often means becoming a pariah, with your own life becoming in danger. Look what happened to Edward Snowden, or Julian Assange, or Bradley Manning. These courageous individuals have given us a real glimpse of what our government is actually doing in the world, things that our government does not want you or I to know about. So as we come into the 50th anniversary of the JFK assassination this month, contemplating our country's decline during the last 50 years becomes extraordinarily upsetting and painful, for we can't help but realize that our country is in an unprecedented state of intellectual, political, moral, and physical decay, spiraling ever downward. You see, our country's history could have been different. The post-World War II narrative largely has to do with the United States becoming a national security state, with the inception of the CIA coming into existence in 1947. Maintaining the American empire as we know it today came about after World War II with the passage of what is known as the National Security Act of 1947, which called for a new bureaucracy that was to be called the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA, from its inception, was virtually unaccountable to any authority. It was subject to little, if any, congressional oversight, a fact that would increasingly haunt both President Harry Truman and his successor, Dwight Eisenhower. Both were troubled by the fact that the agency had a carte blanche, get-out-of-jail card free for anything that it attempted. The elder statesman, George Kennan, would come to deeply regret near the end of his life the power that had been given to the CIA, part of which he signed off on. The get-out-of-jail-free card, known as plausible deniability, was, as Kennan told Yale historian John Lukács, quote, "the greatest mistake I ever made in my life, because you know what the Central Intelligence Agency has devolved or evolved into." During the 1950s, the CIA made a practice of overthrowing democratically elected governments that did not agree with the United States' point of view or the economic interests of the U.S. Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, Sukarno in Indonesia, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, while doing all it could to destroy Castro in Cuba and Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. This was in addition to supporting a number of repressive right-wing military dictatorships that ruthlessly engaged in all kinds of torture of its citizens to squash dissent and maintain control. With regard to Iran, the CIA installed the Shah, leaving the Iranian people to suffer unimaginable horrors under the reign of Savak, the Shah's Highness Praetorian Guard, trained in surveillance, interrogation, and torture. In the interest of promoting American economic growth and hegemony, this was the emerging calling card of the CIA's Allen Dulles and his brother, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. In his 1960 farewell speech, President Eisenhower warned the public to, quote, guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, what he called the military-industrial complex. But the military-industrial complex of which Eisenhower spoke had a third unnamed component, intelligence, warning that the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Eisenhower resoundingly made it clear in that speech that the only antidote for the disastrous rise of misplaced power was, quote, an alert and knowledgeable citizenry. 25 years later, at the end of the Iran-Contra affair in 1987, which should have resulted in the impeachment of Ronald Reagan, the late Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii made the following statement at the end of the congressional hearings, quote, there exists a shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of the national interest, free from all checks and balances and free from the law itself. 2 years earlier, in 1985, Attorney Mark Lane, probably the greatest hero in fighting for the truth of how the CIA had orchestrated the Kennedy assassination, successfully defended the organization known as Liberty Lobby in a retrial against a libel suit brought by none other than the CIA's E. Howard Hunt, the Watergate conspirator. Attorney Lane, in front of an entire courtroom, was able to finally expose Hunt on the witness stand for the pathological liar that he was. Howard Hunt, it turns out, was in fact in Dallas that day of the assassination, acting as one of the paymasters for the conspiracy that assassinated the president. At the end of the trial, jury forewoman Leslie Armstrong would state to what media was in attendance the following conclusion, quote, the evidence was clear. The CIA had killed Kennedy, Hunt had been a part of it, and that evidence so painstakingly presented should now be examined by the relevant institutions of the United States government so that those responsible for the assassination might be brought to justice. Around the nation, however, the Washington Post, the New York Times, as well as the national media completely avoided the story about the jury's verdict, a case where the CIA's role in President Kennedy's assassination had been unanimous and conclusive. The mere fact that President Lyndon Johnson had appointed Allen Dulles, the man who JFK had fired from his position as head of the CIA after the Bay of Pigs fiasco in 1961, to the fabled Warren Commission was nothing more than the fox guarding the hen house. At the very first executive session of the Warren Commission on December 5th, 1963, Dulles wasted no time, not only in establishing himself as the so-called intelligence expert, but also in immediately attempting to control and narrow the parameters of the entire inquiry. According to author Peter Dale Scott, at that meeting, the disgraced spymaster took it upon himself to give each member of the commission a copy of an obscure book that argued that all American assassinations, unlike European ones, were the work of solitary, deranged, and disaffected gunmen, thereby using his influence to immediately discourage any real investigation into the possibility of a conspiracy. Then, during an executive session in late January 1964, where credible information arose that Lee Harvey Oswald was a paid informant for the FBI, Dulles' response was, and I quote verbatim, "I think this record should be destroyed." This is part of how the Warren Commission became the most massive cover-up ever perpetrated upon the citizens of America. Even Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry, in a 1969 interview with the Dallas Morning News, finally admitted the following, quote, we didn't have any proof that Oswald fired the rifle, and never did. Nobody's been able to put him in that building, meaning the Texas School Book Depository, with a gun in his hand. To this day, the Central Intelligence Agency continues its efforts to cover up its role in the Kennedy assassination. It will not release or make public 1,100 long-suppressed CIA records, as much as 50,000 pages related to the assassination of President Kennedy. Let us also not forget that nearly 40 years earlier, in 1975, Senator Richard Schweiker of Pennsylvania, half of a two-man subcommittee within the Senate Church Committee, authorized to investigate the Kennedy assassination and allowed to view some of the yet unseen classified documents at the National Archives, came to the following conclusion about the Warren Commission and its report. Quote, I think that the report, to those who have studied it closely, has collapsed like a house of cards. And I think the people who read it in the long run in the future will see that. I frankly believe that we have shown that the investigation of the John F. Kennedy assassination was snuffed out before it even began, and that the fatal mistake the Warren Commission made was to not use its own investigators, but instead to rely on the CIA and the FBI personnel, which played directly into the hands of senior intelligence officials who directed the cover-up. Senator Schweiker's final conclusion was that, and I quote, we don't know what happened in Dallas, but we do know that Oswald had intelligence connections. Everywhere you look with him, there are the fingerprints of intelligence. In 2007, referring to Oswald's 1959 phony defection to Russia, Schweiker told author David Talbot that the ex-Marine Oswald, quote, was a product of a fake defector program run by the CIA. Schweiker was never convinced the CIA at any time came clean with what it knew. I certainly don't believe the CIA gave us the whole story, said the former senator. 50 years later, after 1963, the important spade work of truly understanding what really happened in Dallas was never done by our government, but by the pioneering researchers who have courageously and tirelessly dug up the real evidence and analyzed the case with scholarly precision, while our government was either indifferent or worse, sought to completely avoid the truth and confuse the public of what actually had happened. And nothing has been more important in the quest than Oliver Stone's film, JFK. This film in 1991 alone transformed the entire zeitgeist of President Kennedy's assassination and our country's understanding of what really took place that day. It then inspired Congress to pass something called the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992, where more than 5 million pages of documents flooded the National Archives, largely from the CIA and the FBI, which led to and exposure of the role of intelligence services in the exercise of American power. The best pieces of writing and the historical records of the Cold War could not have been written or assembled without the documents made available under the JFK Act. But more importantly, the film JFK not only revolutionized the writing of American history in the second half of the 20th century, it accurately revealed the greater truths about the Kennedy assassination, despite the media's and the CIA's efforts to discredit it. The film JFK has become an historical event of its own right, and we should honor Oliver Stone for having restored interest in the Kennedy assassination to several generations of people who were born too late to be susceptible to the obfuscations of the Warren Report and the confused report of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, with its emphasis on the mafia. Even more remarkably, the film has foreshadowed many truths behind the unseen rise of American power that had previously been concealed from the public. Now, let's look at one clip from the film that demonstrates this. The clip that I'm about to show you is historically accurate in the terms of what took place in a conversation between Jack Ruby, the man who murdered Lee Harvey Oswald on national TV, and Chief Justice Earl Warren. Ruby desperately wanted to get away from the prison in Dallas, and he pleaded with the Warren Commission to have him transferred to Washington. Ruby said that he would tell the whole story if they would get him into a safe facility. This was refused. Ruby told Earl Warren, "Well, you won't see me again. I tell you that a whole new form of government is going to come over the country, and I know I won't live to see you another time." While waiting for a second trial, Ruby suddenly became ill and was diagnosed with lung cancer and died in early January of 1967. Ruby maintained he had been injected with a cancer bioweapon in prison. He died within 1 moment of the diagnosis, an extremely rapid progression of the cancer, and of course, he was a non-smoker. So let's see if we can see this clip.
Mr. Chief Justice, you understand that I cannot tell the truth here in Dallas. There are people here who do not want me to tell the truth, who don't want me to have a retrial.
Mr. Ruby, I don't see why you don't just tell us now.
My life is in danger. If you request that I go back to Washington with you, that is, if you want to hear further testimony from me, can you do that? Can you take me with you?
No, that could not be done. There would be no safe place for it. We're not law enforcement officers. Mr. Ruby has a great deal of stake in this matter.
See, if I am eliminated, there won't be any way of knowing any bit of the truth pertaining to my situation. And consequently, a whole new form of government is going to take over this country. Yeah, and I know that I won't live to see you some other time. Because I want to tell the truth, and then I want to leave this world.
Today, in 2013, the ongoing disintegration of our country is ultimately about the corruption of our government. A government that has consistently and intentionally misrepresented and lied to us about what really took place in Dallas in 1963, as it did about the escalation of the Vietnam War that followed, only then to be repeated again in Iraq in 2003. So you see, the same military-industrial complex, as echoed by President Eisenhower as he left office in 1960, in coordination with the intelligence and banking elites, have in fact been the forces that have been plundering governments, economies, and polluting this planet. They also took part in the conspiracy to assassinate a sitting president. In early January of this year, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the son of Robert Kennedy Sr., who was the Attorney General during the Kennedy administration, went public on TV in Dallas with moderator Charlie Rose and stated that his father never believed the Warren Report. Quote, "My father," said RFK Jr. on January 11th of this year, quote, "believed that the Warren Report was a shoddy piece of craftsmanship." Since the publication of the Warren Report in 1964, some 600 books have been written about the assassination of President Kennedy. Almost without exception, no matter what point of view concerning who killed the president or why, these books have directly or indirectly contributed to the public, yours and mine, conviction that the murder of the president is still and will always remain a mystery. As a result, although today more than 80% of people believe that there was some sort of conspiracy involved, most people don't know this as a fact, and they're convinced that they can never know this, what really happened. The public at large, however, is mistaken. The murder of the president is not a mystery. The nature of the conspiracy that took the president's life was from the outset quite obvious to anyone who knew how to look and was willing to do so. The same holds true today. The fact that no one knows this is an example of the subtle process of Orwellian mind control and the mechanism of denial which has enveloped our society and which our public has been more than willing to have foisted upon it, despite the plethora of factual evidence to the contrary. Whether we examine the murder of President Kennedy, Mary Meyer, the global financial crisis, or climate change. In his 1996 book, History Will Not Absolve Us, the Boston psychiatrist Martin Schatz talks about a scene in a play that he wrote 10 years earlier. It's a scene in which Allen Dulles and JFK confront each other in the afterlife. Dulles insists that he was the true upholder of American values and that out of his patriotic duty had the president killed. The two argue back and forth, and finally Dulles says this: "Look, Jack, suppose you had a stroke and died in Daley Plaza instead of being shot. Would the history of the United States be any different? We didn't take over the government, we just shot you." Dulles' fictional claim, as it turns out, was quite accurate. He and the CIA didn't have to take over the government because by 1963, they were completely and firmly embedded in it. The CIA reasoned correctly that the balance of forces, which after November 22nd rested on Lyndon Johnson's mantle, would be on their side if Kennedy was eliminated. So when President Kennedy was killed, the CIA had exactly what it wanted, namely the ability to put a president in place who would follow the CIA's script. Once you penetrate this conundrum, you can easily go back and see in an unobstructed manner what is quintessentially obvious: who killed President Kennedy and why. The journey requires no particular ideological orientation, religious affiliation, sexual orientation, or socioeconomic status. It only requires a commitment to truth and logic and a willingness to confront the dictates of logical analysis of facts wherever they lead, thereby transcending any mechanism of denial as to what really did and did not take place. Now, the tapestry of President Kennedy's killing is enormous. The tapestry of Mary Meyer's is much smaller, and yet they're connected, one to another in ways which became increasingly apparent to me as I dug ever more deeply in their relationship. To understand the complex weave of elements that led to her death, and is to understand in a deeper way one of the most abominable, despicable events in American history. As citizens in a democracy, we all have an obligation and a responsibility to deal with the events of our time so as to protect the fragile nature of our republic. If a democracy is to survive and flourish, then every citizen, every one of us, must find his or her way of making a contribution. In other words, we must all get active, even if it's on the local level in a limited enterprise. We must be able to associate ourselves with the issues of our lifetime. It isn't enough to be a professional, to work hard, raise a family, whatever our circumstances. We simply must find some time to devote ourselves to public affairs, which inevitably means being political in a democracy. Because when people act collectively, rather than just on an individual basis, we are more likely to get a change in policy. And when people unite in sufficient numbers, they really can make a difference. We have only to remember in our lifetime what the anti-war movement did in the late 1960s and 70s to end the Vietnam War. And so with the publication of Mary's Mosaic in April of 2012, I mistakenly thought that this piece of work might come to some conclusion for me, that I might embark on some other journey, maybe even have the opportunity of falling in love again, or at least stopping to smell the scent of lilacs in the spring. I was wrong. My duty as a citizen in our democratic republic, or what's left of it, has only become even more important, because the stakes for our most precious commodity, historical truth, have never been higher at this very moment, given what took place after Mary's Mosaic was released. I want to switch gears now for a few minutes and tell you why. The murder of Mary Meyer took place on October 12, 1964, barely about 10 months, 11 months after JFK's assassination. We have to ask the question, why is it that this particular murder is so important? And one of the reasons right now is that there is an opportunity to find out more what really happened on that day. Now, one of Mary Meyer's closest friends, Anne Truitt, the woman Mary who had asked to safeguard her precious diary should anything happen to her, knew early in 1964 that Mary was involved in an examination of what really had taken place in Dallas. Mary had the access because she lived in Washington, she knew all the players, she was very well known, she was highly thought of. She had access to people at that particular time that very few of us would have. And Anne Truitt's son, Sam Truitt, in his own diary, told me, and put it online, in fact, that Mary Meyer, he believes, had been assassinated, according to what his mother told him, was that she had begun to talk about the Kennedy assassination, suggesting that she had information regarding its perpetrators, and passed that information on to not only Sam's mother, but Sam's mother gave it to Sam. Now, the alleged assailant in this murder was a poor, downtrodden black laborer by the name of Ray Crump. He was arrested nearly an hour after the murder, but he was acquitted 9 months later in July of 1965 for lack of evidence. There wasn't any forensic evidence whatsoever that linked Mr. Crump to the crime scene or to the body of Mary Meyer. Mary Meyer was shot twice with a .38 caliber pistol at close range. The murder had all the markings of a skilled professional assassin. The first shot traversed her skull from left to right. The second shot was just below her right shoulder blade, angled slightly to the left, thereby severing her aorta and killing her instantly. Ray Crump had never owned a gun in 1964. No one in his community, no one in his family had ever seen him with any kind of a firearm of any kind. Already, before the trial is taking place, there's a certain amount of skullduggery taking place within the court system. Mr. Crump was denied a preliminary hearing. His defense was not allowed to see the FBI crime report. So this was a case where a very courageous African-American attorney by the name of Dovey Roundtree decided to defend Mr. Crump for free because she believed that justice needed to be served. She was convinced almost from the very beginning that there was just no way in hell that this guy Ray Crump could have killed this person. Now, on the day of the murder, a man by the name of Lieutenant William L. Mitchell allegedly ran by the woman in question, Mary Meyer, and the next day he goes to the police and says, you know, I saw the story in the newspaper about this woman. I think I may have run by her yesterday because I run on the canal regularly. So, of course, and he said, by the way, there was this black guy following her about 600 feet behind. And Mr. Mitchell gave a description of the clothes that Ray Crump had been wearing that day. So at that very point, this really seals it for the police. They've got a witness now who has spotted Crump, where it has described the clothes that he was wearing. So Mr. Mitchell shows up at the trial 9 months later. He's allegedly no longer in the Army. He tells a reporter that he's teaching at Georgetown University. Yet when one author before me goes to Georgetown in search of his personnel record, Georgetown University has no record of any William L. Mitchell ever teaching there. And during the trial, Mr. Mitchell very cleverly tries to frame Ray Crump to make sure that they convict him. Here is an old newspaper article written by a reporter by the name of Roberta Hornig, who apparently had a short interview with Mr. Mitchell where he told her that he was a part-time teacher at Georgetown University. But again, there is no record of any Mitchell ever teaching there. So, Mr. Mitchell's post-Pentagon life was unknown to me until August of 2012. And it was at this time that after the first edition of the book came out, that I was able to finally locate Mr. Mitchell. Before that time, an author before me by the name of Leo D'Amour had tried to contact him but could not locate him. It turns out that Mr. Mitchell, during the fall of 1964, was living in an apartment complex outside of Washington in Arlington that was a known CIA safe house. I had 3 former CIA people tell me that his address of 1500 Arlington Boulevard in Arlington, an apartment complex known as the Virginian, was regularly used by CIA undercover people. That was an important piece of evidence. And but Mitchell disappears after the trial. No one was able to ever locate him. Now, we find out in August of 2012 that Mr. Mitchell had actually gone to Cornell University in the fall of 1957. He was in a 5-year Bachelor's of Mechanical Engineering program. However, he eludes any picture of himself in any of the Cornell yearbooks, particularly the main one, which is called the Cornellian. There is no picture of Mitchell in any of these yearbooks. I looked through every one of the 5 years, could not find one. The only known picture of Mitchell at Cornell is his group section photo, known in the Cornell Engineer. And there, right there, number 76, is the only picture of William Mitchell that I could ever find while he was there at Cornell for 5 years. Now, if we postulate that Mitchell was possibly recruited into the world of intelligence, how was he recruited? Well, I can only go by, for instance, what Robert Gates, who I'm sure all of you know in one form or another, he was the director of Central Intelligence. He was also the Secretary of Defense for 2 presidents. But Mr. Gates was recruited into the CIA when he was a graduate student at the University of Indiana. And then less than a year later, in August of '66, he joined what he termed the mystical brotherhood of the CIA. Yet he was given no draft deferment by the CIA and would therefore enter the U.S. Air Force under CIA sponsorship just a few weeks after joining. Gates was commissioned as a second lieutenant in 67. He served 2 years at that rank, and then it appears that he went through the Air Force Officer Candidate School on his way to joining the agency. So, like Robert Gates, Mitchell may have been recruited into the CIA while he's an undergraduate at Cornell, although I don't know that for sure. What I do know is that during the 1960-61 academic year, Mitchell is designated as a distinguished military student in the Army ROTC program. Yet none of the Army registers in the National Archives from 1962 to 67 list any William L. Mitchell as a commissioned officer. And given Mitchell's date of birth and social security number, or part of it, the National Personal Record Center in St. Louis has maintained to me and my research associates since 2005 that they have no military record for any William L. Mitchell working at the Pentagon. In an academic citation, Mitchell lists himself in 1965 to 66 as a Fulbright scholar at the University of London. At the same time, he's also still listed in the Department of Defense directory all through 1965. Yet the Fulbright archives have no record of any William Mitchell as a Fulbright participant. So I'm wondering now, has Mitchell's military service record been classified or kept secret? After he gets out of the Army, Mitchell earns a PhD in mathematics from the University of California at Berkeley. He then shows up as an assistant professor at the business school at California State University. He rises to the rank of associate professor. But in 2012, the reference library there, a man by the name of Paul McClellan, identified Mitchell as William L. Mitchell in his initial role as an assistant professor during the 72-73 academic year. He then confirmed that in 74, for some unknown reason, Mitchell started using the name Bill Mitchell. Why does he change his name? Well, it just so happens at that time that the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Intelligence, run by Senator Frank Church, starts its investigation in 1974, with published reports beginning to appear in 75. This is then followed by a more thorough investigation. Did Mitchell and whoever he worked for fear an investigation into the murder of Mary Meyer by Congress? Was Mitchell trying to camouflage himself even further? I believe so. The Social Security for Mitchell was issued in New York. However, Bill Mitchell uses a different Social Security number, one that was issued in California. By 1978, William Mitchell has clearly become Bill Mitchell. He purchases residential property in Northern California under that name. The property is then transferred to a trust owned by Mitchell in 1992. And presently, any reference to Mr. Mitchell's tenure, particularly, whoops.
He's fixing us.
We run out of power here?
Pressing the wrong button.
Let's see. Can't get it back. There we go. No. Wait a minute. There we go. There we go. Okay, so anytime anyone refers to Mr. Mitchell now, it's always, what comes up is Bill Mitchell. How many hundreds of thousands of Bill Mitchells are there in the world compared to how many William Lockwood Mitchells are there? You can see that this appears to be an attempt to, again, get lost in the crowd. So, I went to find Mr. Mitchell, and I knocked on his door because I wanted to talk to him. And this took place in August 27, 2012, and this is what happened.
Mr. Mitchell? I'm not interested. Well, see you later. Could I just talk? I came from Boston. I don't care. I'm not interested. See you later.
So obviously, Mr. Mitchell is not very happy that I found him. Interesting enough, his physical appearance is really at odds with his 70 years of age. He's a runner, very lean, trim, fit guy. But, you know, he's got kind of a paranoid demeanor. He communicates a very frightened, fearful disposition of having been located and found out. We also located his brother, who also refused to talk to us, was very upset that we had found him. So I'm wondering, is there a dirty little family secret here? So in October of 2012, and recently in this year as well, my research associate Roger Charles, a Peabody Award-winning journalist, we meet with two detectives at the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department. And we reviewed how the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis had sent us no information, said that they don't have anything. And so Detective Whalen, as a real assistant to us, as a law enforcement officer, he contacts the NPRC, and as a law enforcement officer, they give these people high priority. And Detective Whalen not only has his date of birth, he has Mitchell's full Social Security number. And he gets a call 7 days later, and the NPRC says, sorry, we don't have any record for any William L. Mitchell. Having been given not only his date of birth, but his full Social Security number. So now we have to ask the question, is Mitchell's service record being intentionally withheld for some reason? Now, this past fall, I decided that I would take Mr. Mitchell to court in a civil action wrongful death lawsuit in Washington, D.C. So we filed the case. It's currently in process. There are certain things I can't talk about this case, but Mr. Mitchell is beginning to sweat a little. And what I can say is that there's going to be more to come. It's going to get even more interesting as the weeks go ahead. But this was what I was forced to do, because the only way I can get Mr. Mitchell to talk or not talk, I mean, if he comes into court and pleads the fifth, takes the fifth, I'm not going to talk because I don't want to incriminate myself. That he's already said enough to me in a certain way. He's hiding something, obviously. So we come back. I want to come back to why is this important today? It's important because to get to the truth of this particular murder only means that eventually we're going to find out why the powers that be decided that they had to terminate this woman's life. Why was she a threat? Well, we know she was a threat because she was going to stand up. After she read the Warren Commission, she was infuriated that this kind of deception was being perpetrated on the American people. She wanted to stand up and tell the public the truth, that she was having an ongoing affair with the president, that she had spent the greater part of 1964 finding out about what took place in Dallas, and it led right to the front and back door of the Central Intelligence Agency, of which her ex-husband was a part of, and which James Jesus Angleton was a close personal friend and the godfather of her remaining two children. She had the capacity to bring down the CIA and many other facets of our government. And that's why I believe she had to be taken out. And that's why I believe that our only possibility now of correcting the historical record is for me to do whatever I can to unearth Mr. Mitchell's military service records in hopes that something comes out that links him to the world of intelligence or links him in some capacity to Mrs. Meyer's demise. And so I'm not ready to smell lilacs in the spring. I don't, I still do want to fall in love, but it may take a little longer time. So, let's stop now and just, I'd like to just change the tone here and give any one of you the opportunity to ask me questions or make comments about what we've been discussing this evening, anything like that. Who would like to say something? Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious. I understand that her brother or brother-in-law was Bradley, and Bradley?
That's right. Her sister was married to Ben Bradley.
Now, was he involved with all of this?
Well, that's a very good question. I do believe that the CIA had a hold on Mr. Bradley. I don't believe that he was aware of what was actually taking place in terms of after it was over. But the fact that it was my own father, that's another dimension of this book, that my own father was involved in the conspiracy to murder Mary Meyer. The fact that it was my father who called Ben Bradley after the murder had taken place in a very kind of orchestrated way to, in a sense, alert him to this event, set a chain reaction of events in which the CIA was controlling the whole thing from start to finish to begin with. And Ben Bradley, in my opinion, was a pawn in that process.
On the Liberty trial, when Garrison was trying to prove that Clay Shaw was CIA, and he could never prove it, but they were able to at that trial, didn't they bring in some CIA people to like testify whether he was an agent?
They did all kinds of skullduggery things.
Yeah.
I mean, they took whatever liberties they had to destroy Garrison's credibility, to get rid of witnesses, kill witnesses before they came to trial. I mean, if you watch the movie, that's why the film JFK, in my opinion, is so important. Because, listen, I've studied this assassination for like 20 years. The film is very accurate. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of dramatic liberties. Every scene in that film has historical truth to it, except the fact that when Jim Garrison goes to Washington and talks with Mr. X, that actually didn't take place. However, Mr. X is a real character in life. He is this man, Fletcher Prouty, of which Oliver Stone based that character on. So it's not that Mr. X is complete fiction. He isn't. And in fact, everything Mr. X says in the film is actually very, very true. It's all based on untold history. And Mr. Prouty wrote two very important books during his lifetime. The Secret, well, one of them is JFK in Vietnam, and then the other one is called The Secret Team. Yes. Next question or comment. Yes, sir.
Well, first, I want to thank you for what you're doing, because your work is important. This is important history. And my minor question is, what about the diary, Mary's diary that you mentioned? Was that recovered, or what happened?
The true diary has never been recovered. There was this artist's sketchbook that Mr. Bradley and others tried to maintain was Mary's diary, but it isn't. Her diary was stolen, I believe, the night of the murder by either Ben Bradley and Mr. Angleton together, or Mr. Angleton alone, who went to her house that night. And it could have been in the bookcase in her bedroom. It was likely in her artist's studio, which Mr. Bradley and Mr. Angleton entered on the night of the murder.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
I did read your hardcover, the hardcover of your book, and in that book I thought someone has talked to Mr. Mitchell, and didn't somebody have a talk with him about what transpired with Mary Meyer?
Yes, that was Leo D'Amour. Allegedly, there was a phone call in 1993 where the author D'Amour talked to Mitchell, but it's not, I don't know if he was actually talking to Mitchell or someone who impersonated Mr. Mitchell. I discussed that more in the second edition of the book, there's a postscript chapter where I go into that in more detail.
Sorry, was her ex-husband, Cord Meyer, also involved in the diary? I was trying to read that, but I wasn't sure if he was involved in trying to find the diary?
Well, he made it look like he was. But of course, Cord Meyer very intentionally keeps a low profile in his ex-wife's murder, the search for the diary. He doesn't want to raise his level of participation beyond a certain point. So, of course, in my opinion, Cord Meyer knows everything that went on.
Yeah, 'cause I'm sure it
he's
was
conveniently out of Washington that day. He's called by my father late in the afternoon, allegedly to tell him what happened, you know, I mean, to make it look good. I mean, if you read the book, and I don't want to spoil it for you, because it really does read like a detective novel, except that it's true. You will see the level of planning, the level of intrigue that the power of the CIA went to make this murder look like just a simple random act of violence, when in fact it was something very, very different. Yes, sir?
Is there any law about when those records have to, need to be, should be released? Is it 75 years or something, and they can choose to do it earlier? I mean, it's 50 years later, as you say, thousands of pages haven't been brought to the public. Can that continue?
The CIA can do anything that it wants until somebody until I think someone in Congress says enough. You know, we're going to give you a congressional order. You have to release them. You are accountable to, our government. And of course, the CIA always claims, oh no, it's in the national security. We can't release it. It'll violate this operation, that operation. It's bunk. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was wondering, I read years ago about Mary Meyer and John Kennedy possibly smoking marijuana and doing LSD. Can you tell me anything about that?
I believe it's true. They certainly smoked pot in the White House a couple of times. And I think on the basis of some credible information, I do think they did a mild hallucinogenic LSD or psilocybin experience several weeks before President Kennedy made his historic American University commencement speech. I believe it took place in May. I don't think, of course, it was, the straw that broke the camel's hump. I mean, President Kennedy was headed toward really changing his tune, turning away from the Cold War toward world peace initiatives. But I think his relationship with Mary Meyer was critically important to him. This was a relationship of redemption for President Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy had a lot of problems with intimacy. He had a lot of problems with women. Mary Meyer was not at all intimidated by the president. She wasn't going to take any crap from him. And if he wanted to hang out with her, he needed to understand that he was going to have to show up and participate and be part of a real relationship. And I think there was something about this process for President Kennedy as a psychologist that really stimulated him. He found in Mary a woman who he could actually respect and lean on, and who would be very deeply supportive of who he was and what he was trying to do. And I believe, as he told his chief assistant, Kenny O'Donnell, that after he told Kenny O'Donnell that after he left the White House, he really wanted to divorce Jackie so that he could be with Mary. I mean, they were in a substantial relationship together, and the people who knew him closely knew how much in love he was with Mary Meyer. Yes, sir.
James Hamilton was your godfather?
Not my godfather. He was the godfather to the Meyer children.
Oh, you knew him?
I knew him, yes.
What did you think of him?
Well, he's a very hard. I mean, a little boy. You know, I was 6, 7, 8 years old. He was a friend of my father's. I saw him any number of times. I never particularly liked him. He wasn't a particularly warm person. But I only knew him from a very meager vantage point.
You think he was involved in the assassination of the president?
Absolutely. I think he was one of the primal architects of the plan. Alan Dulles being the project manager of the assassination. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have read your book, and in your book you have a person who worked as a security personnel in the White House for an extended period of time.
That would be Joseph Scheiman.
Right.
Yeah.
What was he in the Secret Service? What was his capacity? And he told some interesting things to his children.
To his daughter.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Scheiman had a number of connections. He had a CIA badge, he had a Secret Service badge, he worked in the White House, he was friends of any members of the mafia. But he had one child, a daughter who's my age, her name is Tony, and through the years, he decided that he didn't want to lose her, and he had to confide in her because she kept asking him about what really happened. And so he told her some very, very sensitive things, and I met Mrs. Scheiman, her name is Tony Scheiman, you can read about her in the book, and she and I became friends, and she decided to share with me much of what her father had told her, not only about what happened to the president, but what happened to Mary Meyer, and that comes at part of the end of my book. Yes, sir.
When you have a case like this, or a lot of other cases where people are looking for records from the CIA, old records to be turned over, and for years they try to get these records, what's to stop the CIA from already having some perfectly prepared fake records ready to handle?
Nothing.
Well, I mean, no assurance of that, too, right? I mean,
well,
why wouldn't they,
Right.
If they're guilty.
Yeah, and that may ultimately be the case, that will happen. Fortunately for me, I have some very savvy research people, colleagues, who have for years, studied military records. They know what's bona fide, they know what isn't.
Yeah.
So hopefully if this starts to happen, this can be spotted before it gets underway. But you never know, it's like, for me, I have to go the extra mile here and see if I cannot get to the end of this. The end would be, if I got a hold of Mr. Mitchell's military records and they clearly, in those records, have links to the world of intelligence, then I've made my case. And then I have to decide, okay, is it time to take the final step, which I think would be a lawsuit against the CIA itself. I'd have to find an attorney who'd be willing to take it on contingency and would have enough stature in the legal community to really, there'd have to be a lot of publicity around the case, that kind of thing. But it could happen. It could happen. For me, it's just a mandate in my own life to get to the bottom of this one way or another. And, the bottom may be that there are no records, and I'll have to live with that, and it's time to move on. But in the meantime, it's important to keep taking whatever little steps I can to get to the bottom of it. Yes?
You can answer this any way or not. Have you ever felt any threats because of your research?
Good question. People ask me that a lot, and the answer is I've never been overtly threatened. However, when I talked to one former CIA person who I got to know really well, and this subject came up, he said to me, "Peter, they're not going to threaten you, they're just going to do it." But now that the book is out, it wouldn't be to their benefit to take me out, because it would just, raise...
Confirm everything.
Yeah, it would backfire. It's not something that they would want to do. Yes?
I have to wonder why the CIA didn't do a better job of hiding Mr. Mitchell. Changing your name from William to Bill isn't
that great.
That's pretty easy to figure out.
Well, I mean...
Couldn't they... send him to another country or?
Maybe he didn't want to go.
No.
You see, I mean, I do think Mr. Mitchell was not the trigger man in this case. But however, I still believe that there's enough circumstantial evidence that he was part of the assassination team that day. But I don't think Mitchell was the actual assassin. I didn't know that before. I'm more convinced of that now. But I still think Mr. Mitchell can tell us many, many details, confirm many, many details that I have long believed that would, really bring this into the light of day. Yes, sir, you right there.
Do you think that E. Howard Hunt's confession then is fairly close to what occurred? And also, I haven't read that far in your book yet, but has Joe Scheinman's daughter ever written anything? And wasn't he in the same organization as the man you said you had doing some intelligence work for you in Washington, cop?
Well, Joe Scheinman's daughter has not written anything on her own, no. I don't think she wants to do that because you have to remember that growing up in that area, when your father is in a sense part of the Ivy League mafia, it takes a toll on us as children. And I think to be honest, I've had 2 failed marriages and no children of my own, and that's not by accident. I made a decision when I decided to take this on that it would be too dangerous for me to be married at a particular time, and it would certainly be too dangerous for me to have a family. This was a decision I had to make that if I was going to do this, I was going to take it, I was going to go the distance, and there were some significant sacrifices that had to be made. And I think having a father in the shadowy world of intelligence who isn't honest with you about who he is and what he does for a living, it does have psychological ramifications, some of it often being quite traumatic.
I think we need to wrap it up if you want to have time to sell some books.
Okay.
Can you,
So I'll take one more question.
One more.
Right here.
Can I make it twofold?
Sure.
First, since you're a psychologist, give me an overview of how you were treated by the reviewers, the print reviewers, and your interviewers, what's your read on them, and maybe also comment on the Scarboroughs and the Chris Matthews and what their psyche is all about. Are they in denial? Are they conditioned in a Pavlovian sense? Are they liars? Just generally comment on that. And also I want to ask you about Watergate overall. I consider Watergate a half-truth. I consider it ultimately, objectively, a psychological operation. I know all the Watergate people were guilty. That's not my point. Objectively, I think Woodward and Bernstein are guilty of half-truth telling. If you know Jim Hogan, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm a Jim Hogan guy.
Yep.
I love the guy.
Yep.
And we comment on that. In other words, Hogan is like you. He sees the big picture.
Right.
And so where does Woodward, especially because of his fall into this, who is he?
Right.
Because he wrote Vale, and Vale did not begin to tell the story of Casey. I'm sorry.
Right.
But could you comment on
Well, I'll say a few things because our time is limited, but I will say that I believe personally that Watergate was a CIA operation to get rid of Richard Nixon.
Yes.
They didn't want to shoot him, but they had to get rid of
Right.
him. Now, why did they want to get rid of Richard Nixon? Because he was asking too many questions about the Kennedy assassination.
Right.
And Richard Nixon knew what had taken place, and he was terrified that he might end up the same way.
Right.
And so he was putting a lot of pressure on the Central Intelligence Agency to cough up records that they didn't want to show to him.
Okay.
And so they had to think of a way to get him out of office. It's no accident that E. Howard Hunt was working in the White House, allegedly retired from the CIA. You don't retire from the CIA at Hunt's level. You're there for life.
Right.
Okay? Now, what was the other part of your question?
Just
Okay, the mainstream,
Yeah, how you treat the print, how you're treated in print,
Okay.
and
Terrible.
interviewing, and then just talk about, you know, even the Ignatiuses or the Humes and the Scarboroughs, talk about them. Are they just frightened to death? Are they conditioned? Are they in denial?
no, they're shills. They're shills for the US government.
You mean the whores?
Yeah, yeah.
My
That-
God.
You know, I could never, I almost got on Joe Scarborough's.
I'm not accusing, I'm just saying.
I'm
Let's
telling
be, you know.
I almost got on Joe Scarborough's program Morning Joe, but then they nixed it at the last moment because the producer wouldn't allow me on the show. Because what I was gonna say and what was gonna be talked about was antithetical
You would have
to
sold
what
1 million copies of your book.
I would have. You know, there was one morning when Joe Scarborough was talking to Richard Belzer, where he said to Richard, but Richard, Mary Meyer was probably the only woman JFK ever loved, you know, and of course, Joe Scarborough had read my book. He was very intrigued by it, but he couldn't have me on his show because of, you know, the flack that they would have taken. I mean, you don't see any mainstream media program that where people can talk about 9/11 truthfully, or they can talk about the Kennedy assassination.
Just quickly, in a review of your book in the Globe, if I remember correctly, there's a guy named Tim Weiner, who I saw on C-SPAN.
Right.
You talk about a Midwestern, chubby-faced, all-American boy. I saw him, correct me if I'm wrong, say in print that the CIA never killed anybody.
Right.
Am I mistaken?
Mm-mm.
And I saw him interview. I said, this guy looks like everybody's next door neighbor, the boy next door.
Right.
And he wrote a book about
Won the Pulitzer
something
Prize.
like Ashes or something.
Legacy of Ashes.
Legacy of Ashes.
Won the
I saw the interview.
Won the
and-
Pulitzer Prize.
Well, then, that's a metaphor for the whole deal.
Yes.
Because
Yes, that's indicative of how much the national security apparatus controls the media.
So who's Tim Weiner then?
Well, he's an author that wants to get
but
out.
who is he? Who
Is he with the
He
CIA?
He knows stuff. He's conversant with all the.
You'll have to ask him who.
No, I'm saying sort of rhetorical.
Right. I understand, but you see, I mean, the point for
Well, it's maddening.
yes, it is frightening, and that's what's
maddening.
It is maddening too, and that's what's important for all of us to realize. You know how far our media has been taken over by the forces of our government. Okay, it's just a
He
reality.
faces his wife and his family and his friends and his colleagues.
You'll have to ask him.
I know, that's what he drives me to the board.
Thank you very much for coming.